blood on his hands, a lifeless body on the kitchen floor, sirens in the distance, and James Holloway standing still, confused, shocked, and speechless. Was he a killer in denial, or the fall guy in someone else's plan? The rain hadn't stopped for hours. Thunder cracked over the quiet Atlanta suburb as water ran like blood down the sidewalks. Inside apartment 3B, James Holloway sat motionless on the floor, his back against the wall, the metallic scent of blood clinging to the air. The cold blade of a kitchen knife lay beside him, slick and red. Across from him, sprawled lifeless on the laminate floor, was Mia Thompson, the woman he loved. His hands trembled, not from guilt but from shock, or confusion, or maybe both. He blinked, trying to understand how he got here. He couldn't remember the last 10 minutes, or maybe it was 20. Time didn't make sense anymore. The front door slammed open. Flashlights pierced the darkness. Dropped the weapon. Hands in the air. James looked down. The knife was next to him. His palms were stained with blood. He didn't resist. He couldn't. There was nothing to say. He wasn't even sure what he'd done. Within seconds he was tackled, cuffed, and pulled to his feet. The room filled with officers, EMTs, and voices shouting over each other. But all James could focus on was Mia, her eyes wide open, staring into nothing. James Holloway wasn't the kind of man people expected to see on the evening news. He was a 34-year-old high school history teacher with a quiet reputation, a clean record, and a calm demeanor. He loved books more than people, rarely drank, and always showed up early to work. His colleagues admired him. His students respected him. And Mia? She was the opposite. Charismatic. Restless. A freelance journalist who chased adrenaline like it owed her money. They met at a coffee shop 3 years earlier and had been living together for almost a year. Their friends called them an odd match, but a good one. Until now. The police report that night was damning. James was found at the scene, covered in Mia's blood. There were no signs of forced entry. The weapon was from the apartment's kitchen. And the neighbors? They heard arguing. Loud arguing. Around 10:42 p.m. A timeline began forming before James could even be questioned. When he finally sat in the interrogation room, dazed and pale, the detective's voice was cold. "You don't remember killing her?" "I didn't," James whispered. "I couldn't have. Your prints are on the knife. Her blood's on your shirt. You were the only one there. I don't know what happened. I came home and she was already..." But his words didn't matter. Not to the detectives. Not to the media. And soon not to the public. Within 24 hours, the story had exploded. Teacher charged in girlfriend's brutal slaying. Tragic domestic dispute ends in blood. Jealous lover or mental break? Photos of James and Mia flooded social media. People speculated about hidden abuse, mental illness, drugs, a possible affair. No one really knew, but that didn't stop anyone from judging. And then came the biggest blow. Dean Carr. He'd been James's college friend. A drinking buddy turned occasional roommate who'd crashed on their couch the year before. The two had fallen out after a bitter argument over money and boundaries. But now Dean was back, with a story. According to his statement, James had confided in him 2 weeks earlier about suspicions that Mia was cheating. Dean claimed James had said, "If she's playing me, I'll make sure she regrets it." That quote, printed in bold across newspapers and screens, sealed James's fate in the public eye. But what the public didn't know, what the investigators never seemed interested in, was the deeper truth. James had no history of violence. He and Mia had their differences, sure, but their fights were never physical. In fact, Mia had once told her sister, "James is too passive to kill a spider, let alone a person." The physical evidence was strong, but not perfect. The timeline had gaps. The blood spatter patterns were inconsistent. The lack of fingerprints on the handle of the knife raised questions. But the prosecutors didn't need perfect. They just needed enough. And James? He was too shocked to defend himself properly. His court-appointed attorney was overworked, and his trauma made him appear emotionless on the stand. The jury mistook silence for guilt. The judge didn't allow in key testimony about Mia's possible conflicts with her investigative work. It all fell apart. By the time the trial date was set, James had been sitting in county jail for 8 months. Isolated. Forgotten. No visitors. No supporters. Just the echo of Mia's voice in his nightmares. He knew what the world believed. That he snapped. That he killed her in a jealous rage. That he was a monster hiding behind a mild exterior. But what James didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that somewhere out there someone else held the truth. Someone who watched from the shadows. Someone who knew exactly what happened in apartment 3B that night. And they were about to come forward, in the most unexpected way. He walked into the courtroom still clinging to hope. But that hope would burn fast, because the next witness didn't just know James, he knew how to destroy him. James Holloway sat motionless at the defense table, his palms sweating despite the freezing air conditioning. In front of him stood a tall, clean-shaven man in a crisp gray suit, delivering the opening remarks for the prosecution. ADA Colton Mercer, young, ambitious, and already known for winning cases that didn't seem winnable. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mercer began, pacing like a tiger ready to pounce, "you are about to hear a story about betrayal, about rage, about a man who couldn't control his temper, and killed the woman he claimed to love." James's heart pounded in his chest like a drumline. He could barely breathe. His court-appointed lawyer, Sandra Lynn, whispered, "Steady. Don't react." But how could he not? Everything they were saying, it was a lie. The prosecution wasted no time. They rolled out the damning evidence quickly. James was the only one at the scene. The weapon was found beside him. He had no solid alibi for the time of death. His fingerprints were smudged on the knife handle. He had been drinking that night. Then came the bombshell witness, Dean Carr. Dressed sharply, hair slicked back, Dean oozed confidence as he took the stand. He barely glanced at James. "Mr. Carr," Mercer began, "how long have you known the defendant?" "Since college. Almost 12 years. "And would you say you were close?" "We were, yeah. Until things changed." "Tell us about the conversation you had with Mr. Holloway 2 weeks before the murder." James's stomach turned. Dean leaned forward, feigning hesitation. James was acting off. "He told me he thought Mia was cheating on him. He said he was going to confront her. I told him to cool off, but then he said, and I quote, 'If she's playing me, I'll make sure she regrets it.'" Gasps rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't true. None of it. James wanted to scream. Dean was lying. Twisting things. But Sandra whispered again, "Stay calm. We'll dismantle it on cross." But they didn't. When Sandra questioned Dean, she stumbled. She wasn't prepared for his smug evasiveness. Dean danced around her questions, always a step ahead, always charming. She tried to bring up Dean's past financial issues, his freeloading, his rocky history with both James and Mia, but the judge ruled much of it inadmissible. "Irrelevant character assassination," he declared. The jury watched silently, but James could see it. The shift. The moment they started to believe Dean more than they believed him. The next day brought forensic testimony. The state's lead forensic analyst testified that while DNA on the knife was inconclusive, it didn't rule out James. That phrase, "didn't rule out," landed like a death sentence. They played audio of the 911 call. The dispatcher's voice. The chaos in the background. Then came body cam footage of James being arrested, disoriented, bloody, and seemingly dazed. Mercer paused the footage and said, "This is not the face of an innocent man. This is the face of a man who knows what he's done." Sandra objected, but the damage was done. The defense team tried their best. They called in one of Mia's coworkers who testified that Mia had recently been receiving threatening messages, anonymous texts after publishing a controversial story about prescription drug abuse among local officials. But Mercer dismissed it as a red herring and emphasized that no messages had been recovered from her phone. They also brought in a psychological expert who testified that James showed signs of trauma and dissociation, not guilt. But again, it wasn't enough. The jury didn't want nuance. They wanted a villain. And Dean had given them one. When it came time for James to testify, Sandra was hesitant. "It's risky," she told him. "They'll eat you alive on cross." But James insisted. Taking the stand, he tried to speak clearly, calmly. He told the jury about that night. About how he came home from work, had a drink, and went to bed early. About waking up to find Mia bleeding, cold. About calling 911 in a panic. But under Mercer's cross-examination, his answers wavered. "You say you don't remember the moment she died," Mercer sneered. "How convenient." "I didn't kill her," James repeated, voice cracking. "Then why did your neighbor hear shouting at 10:42 p.m.? I don't know." "And why did you tell Mr. Carr that she'd regret it?" "I never said that." "But he says you did." A long silence followed. Mercer leaned in close to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence speaks for itself. It took the jury only 6 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty of second-degree murder." James didn't cry. He didn't shout. He simply sat there, the life draining from his eyes as the gavel came down. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Dean smiled as he walked out of the courtroom. And James? He was left wondering how truth could drown so easily in a sea of lies. He'd survived riots, darkness, and the ache of betrayal, but what broke him wasn't prison walls, it was the letter that whispered, "I saw everything." Prison had a way of swallowing time. 1 hour stretched into eternity, and the noise never stopped. Shouting inmates, clanging bars, slamming doors. James Holloway had stopped counting the days. What was the point? The court had already stolen 25 years from him. Maybe more. At first he refused to accept it. Each morning he'd tell himself this was temporary, that the truth would come out. But weeks turned to months and belief gave way to numbness. The prison guards called him Professor because of his calm demeanor and bookish habits. He spent most of his time in the library reading anything he could get his hands on, psychology, law, true crime. He wasn't trying to become a lawyer. He was trying to understand the system that had buried him alive. His fellow inmates were less forgiving. To many of them he was a lady killer. A man who'd murdered the woman he loved. Some kept their distance. Others made threats. One night, a man named J-Rock cornered him in the yard. "You look like the type who folds easy," J-Rock said. "That true, Professor?" James didn't flinch. "I'm not your enemy. You killed a woman, man. Don't talk like you're righteous." "I didn't." J-Rock stared him down. Then, without a word, walked away. It was the closest James had come to a confrontation. But something had changed in him since the trial. Fear no longer controlled him. What more could they take? It was during one of those long, hollow winters that the letter arrived. It was tucked inside a plain envelope with no return address. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, possibly written by someone with shaking hands. James opened it slowly, expecting junk or another cruel joke from inmates. But instead it read, "I saw everything that night. You weren't alone in that hallway. The man who walked out wasn't you. I tried to speak once, but they shut me down. Now I'm dying, and I don't want to carry this secret with me. Her blood is not on your hands." There was no name, no signature. But the final line chilled him to his core. "You didn't kill her." "He did." James stared at the letter for what felt like hours. Who was he? Who had seen what? And why now? He turned it over and saw a second note in smaller script. Unit 4B. Leonard Brooks. Talk to him before it's too late. His hands trembled. That name, he'd heard it before. Brooks was a quiet old man who rarely left his cell. Rumor was he was dying of liver failure. A recluse. An ex-con with a history of burglaries and assault. But more importantly, he was in the same building the night Mia was murdered. Getting to Brooks wasn't easy. James had to lie to a guard and trade 2 weeks of commissary just to get moved to kitchen duty near Unit 4B. He waited until lights out and slipped past the guards during trash duty. He tapped lightly on Brooks's cell door. A gravelly voice answered. "You're late." James froze. "Get in here," Brooks said, coughing. "We don't have much time." Inside, Leonard Brooks looked like a man already half buried. Gaunt face. Yellowing eyes. But his mind? Razor sharp. "I remember that night," Brooks rasped. "I lived right above you. Heard yelling, then footsteps. Looked out my peephole." James leaned in. "I saw him, your buddy. Dean Carr." James's heart stopped. He had blood on his sleeve, shaking like a damn leaf. Took the fire escape down. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" James asked. "I tried. Told the cops. But no one listened. Then some guy showed up, said to shut my mouth unless I wanted my parole revoked." James narrowed his eyes. "What guy?" "Didn't get a name. Drove a silver Lexus, had a badge he never showed properly. Paid off the warden. Told me to forget what I saw. Are you willing to go public now?" Brooks coughed violently, wiping blood on a rag. "I'm dying. Nothing left to lose." 2 weeks later, James contacted his only remaining advocate, Elena Ruiz, a journalist who'd once covered Mia's writing and believed in James's innocence. She visited the prison, sat face to face with Brooks, and recorded everything. His confession was chilling. He described the angle, the time, the sound of Dean's voice yelling, "You think you can leave me?" It wasn't just hearsay anymore. It was specific. It matched the crime scene. And most importantly, it wasn't public knowledge. The story exploded online. Ruiz's article went viral within 48 hours. Wrong man behind bars? Eyewitness confession sheds new light on Holloway case. Advocacy groups jumped in. Legal reformers demanded a review. But the DA's office refused to budge. Unreliable witness, they said. Dying man with nothing to lose. Still, momentum grew. Elena released audio from Brooks's deathbed interview, syncing his story with cell tower records. His description of Dean's car, a beat-up silver Lexus, matched footage from a nearby ATM camera never introduced at trial. The cracks in the case began to widen. James waited. Every hour passed like a week. Then one Friday morning he was summoned to the warden's office. A federal investigator sat across from him, clipboard in hand. Serious eyes. "We believe there may have been a suppression of evidence during your trial," she said. "We're reopening the case." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. The voice on the tape, raw, trembling, and undeniable, whispered a truth that shattered years of lies. "I didn't mean to kill her, but she said she was leaving me." 4 years, James Holloway's voice had gone unheard, buried beneath the weight of injustice and institutional failure. But in a strange twist of fate, it was someone else's voice that would finally tear down the walls that imprisoned him. The revelation of Leonard Brooks's testimony sparked nationwide media attention. It wasn't every day that a dying convict dropped a bombshell that upended a closed murder case. But what made it more explosive was who Brooks claimed to have seen: Dean Carr, James's former best friend, and the prosecution's key character witness. Dean had painted James as possessive, angry, and jealous. The emotional blueprint that helped convict James had been built entirely on Dean's word. Now that blueprint was collapsing. A few weeks after Brooks's taped confession was released by journalist Elena Ruiz, another twist emerged. While reviewing old interview transcripts, Elena stumbled upon something curious. A footnote from a police report marked, Exhibit B, tape recovered but not submitted. The tape had been recorded by the Holloway's apartment building's night maintenance supervisor, Rudy Halvorson. At the time, he had turned in a cassette tape with strange audio he'd recorded on his handheld radio scanner. No one had ever followed up. Ruiz tracked Rudy down. Now retired and living in South Carolina, he still had the original cassette. "I figured it didn't matter," he said, sliding the dusty tape across the table. "They made it clear they didn't want anything messy. She took the tape and drove straight back to Atlanta. What the tape revealed would shake the justice system to its core. Elena sat in her sound editor's booth, headphones on, volume low to catch every detail. The tape started with a crackle. Then a faint voice, mid-argument, hissed through static. "You think you're just gonna walk away from me? After everything?" Another voice, Mia's, shouted back. "Dean, stop. I'm not doing this." Then a scuffle. Furniture scraping. Heavy breathing. And finally the chilling whisper. "I didn't mean to kill her, but she said she was leaving me." Ruiz froze. It wasn't James's voice. She had heard it 100 times. This voice was lower, less controlled, slurred slightly. And the name, Dean. It confirmed everything Leonard Brooks had said. She sent it to a forensic audio expert. Within 48 hours, they confirmed a 90% vocal match with Dean Carr. The following week, Elena held a press conference on the courthouse steps. "I have here," she said, holding up a USB, "a previously suppressed piece of evidence that contains a confession, not from James Holloway but from Dean Carr, the man who testified against him." The crowd exploded. Reporters swarmed. Cameras rolled. The DA's office, now under pressure, had no choice but to reopen the case. James, still in prison, watched the press conference through a grainy TV screen in the rec room. He felt numb, not from disbelief but from years of hardened caution. The state had lied before. Would they really admit fault now? It didn't take long for the case to move forward. The Georgia Innocence Project filed an emergency petition, and the judge granted a hearing to consider new evidence. James sat in the courtroom shackled and flanked by guards, but this time the energy felt different. Elena was in the front row, and beside her sat a small group of civil rights attorneys, reform advocates, and Holloway's aging parents. On the table in front of the judge was the tape recorder. The court grew quiet as the audio played. "You think you're just gonna walk away from me? Dean, stop. I didn't mean to kill her." Gasps filled the room. The judge leaned forward. "Has this tape been verified?" "Yes, Your Honor," one of the attorneys said. 3 independent voice analysts have confirmed the speaker is Dean Carr. Dean was subpoenaed to testify. He walked into court dressed in a pressed suit, calm and collected. But the moment the tape was played again, his face turned pale. He tried to deflect, saying the tape was doctored. But the judge had already heard enough. "You lied under oath. You obstructed justice. You helped send an innocent man to prison." The judge ordered Dean be held for perjury and obstruction. Meanwhile, a motion to vacate James Holloway's conviction was granted pending final review. That night, James sat in a quiet holding room, not yet free, but closer than he'd been in over 16 years. He picked up a pen and wrote the only thing that mattered in his journal. Truth has a sound. It doesn't whisper forever. 16 years behind bars. One false testimony. One suppressed tape. And now James Holloway was a free man. But what waited for him outside the prison walls wasn't justice. It was a world that had already moved on, and a truth no one saw coming. The metal gates creaked open. James Holloway stepped into the daylight for the first time in over 16 years. The sun scorched his skin like it had forgotten him. His shoes, the same ones issued when he first entered prison, barely held together. His face was gaunt, beard grown in patches of gray, but his eyes, those still carried fire. Reporters waited in droves, shouting his name, asking about his first meal, how he felt, whether he would sue the state. Flashbulbs lit up his face like he was a returning war hero. But James didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. 2 days earlier, the judge officially vacated his conviction, citing suppressed evidence, perjury, and prosecutorial misconduct. The courtroom had erupted in applause. James, however, didn't flinch. The truth had set him free, yes, but it had also destroyed something permanent inside him. Elena Ruiz met him just beyond the courthouse steps. She handed him a simple navy blue duffel bag filled with essentials, clean clothes, a prepaid phone, and envelopes labeled housing, legal aid, and therapy. "I don't know how to say this," she said softly, "but I'm sorry, James. I'm so sorry." He nodded. That was all he could manage. The transition from inmate to free man was anything but graceful. The halfway house they assigned him to was in a rundown Atlanta neighborhood, its peeling paint and sour odor a reminder that even freedom had tears. Every time he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. The system had stolen his best years. Mia was gone. His parents were too frail to visit. Old friends had faded like background noise. The outside world was fast, loud, and unforgiving. He didn't know how to use a smartphone. Self-checkouts confused him. The simplest acts, buying groceries, crossing the street, felt like performances he hadn't rehearsed. But what haunted him most wasn't the lost time. It was the question that refused to let go. Why did Dean Carr do it? Dean had confessed, sort of. The voice on the tape, the timeline, the motive, they all lined up. Yet Dean still denied it, claiming he didn't remember saying those things, that he was emotionally manipulated by Mia, and that James was unstable. It was clear Dean wasn't acting alone. James's therapist, assigned by the Innocence Project, urged him to let it go. But he couldn't. 1 week after his release, James got a text from an anonymous number. He wasn't the only one. Look deeper. Check Mia's last assignment. A friend. His blood ran cold. Mia had been an investigative journalist. Passionate. Relentless. A truth digger who never shied from danger. She'd been working on a piece about police corruption and drug trafficking just weeks before her death. The theory during the trial had been that she and James fought over infidelity. But now, a new possibility emerged. What if Mia's murder wasn't personal at all? What if it was silencing? James reached out to Elena. Together, they went through Mia's old articles, encrypted emails, and recovered hard drives. One particular thread caught their attention. A message from Mia to a confidential source, dated just 4 days before her death, read, "I think Dean is involved in something darker. He won't admit it, but I think he's being used, or paid. I need to confront him." This was the missing link. Back at the halfway house, James stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. All this time he thought Mia died in a domestic dispute, that he was the scapegoat of a jealous friend. But now it seemed much more sinister. Dean Carr wasn't just lying to protect himself. He may have been silencing someone else's enemy. And James? He was just collateral damage. The next morning, Elena returned with more chilling news. Dean had fled the city. Right after his perjury hearing, he posted bail and disappeared. His apartment was empty. Bank accounts drained. Flight records showed nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Someone was helping him. Someone with reach. James looked at Elena, his voice low but steady. "I want to know the truth. Not just for me, for Mia." She nodded. "Then we keep going. Together." Dean Carr was just the pawn. The real killer, the one Mia had uncovered before her death, was still free, still powerful, and still watching. But this time, James Holloway wasn't going to be silenced. He was going to expose the man in the shadows. The pieces were there. They'd always been there, buried beneath court transcripts, drowned out by headlines, dismissed by police reports. James Holloway had been framed. but not just by a jealous friend. The real perpetrator had been operating in plain sight, carefully pulling strings, manipulating testimonies, and, most disturbingly, silencing anyone who got too close, including Mia Harper. After Dean Carr vanished, James and Elena knew they had limited time. They retraced Mia's last 3 investigations. One case stood out, the Hayward District scandal. Mia had been tracking a group of corrupt Atlanta police officers tied to a stream of illegal foreclosures and drug seizures that never made it to evidence rooms. Whistleblowers disappeared. One attorney died in a car crash deemed accidental. Mia believed the operation was being protected by someone in the district attorney's office. Her emails referenced someone she called the broker. No real name. No address. But there was one meeting she'd scheduled, on the night before her death. Location, Pierce Park, 10:15 p.m. She never made it. Through a public records request, Elena retrieved traffic cam footage from the area. One vehicle appeared multiple times circling the park, a black Chevrolet Tahoe with government plates. The car was registered to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. More specifically, Assistant DA Russell Keener. James remembered Keener from his trial. He was the polished, charismatic prosecutor who had convinced the jury that James was a violent, jealous man. He emphasized Mia's fear, played clips of arguments, twisted facts until they formed a weapon. The jury loved him. His delivery was flawless. But now, they had reason to believe he was more than a master litigator. He was the man Mia was meeting that night. He was the broker. Elena hesitated. If we go after Keener, we'll be playing with fire. James didn't flinch. We already are. They leaked the car footage anonymously to a local reporter known for investigative bombshells. Within 48 hours, the story exploded. DA office implicated in suppressed evidence scandal. Keener held a press conference denying everything. But behind the scenes, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation opened a quiet probe. Then the real break came, a second tape. It had been hidden in Mia's encrypted hard drive all along, mislabeled as Podcast Draft 5. The audio was raw, crackling, but it was Mia recording her thoughts. If something happens to me, look at Keener. He tried to bury the foreclosure case. He's funding Dean to get information on me. Dean's scared, but he's involved. And James has no idea. He'll take the fall if they succeed. I need to move fast. The impact was immediate. Protesters surrounded the DA's office. Civil rights organizations called for Keener's resignation. Former whistleblowers came forward. The FBI got involved. Keener was arrested under suspicion of evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and potentially orchestrating a murder cover-up. Dean Carr was captured trying to flee into Mexico. He cut a deal with federal prosecutors, immunity in exchange for testimony. And when he spoke, the room shook. He revealed it all. Keener had paid him to mislead police, testify against James, and gain Mia's trust. When Mia got too close, Keener ordered her death, making it look like a domestic dispute. Dean had lured her to the apartment under false pretenses. She thought she was getting information. She walked into a trap. And James walked into it moments later. In March of the following year, James Holloway was officially declared innocent. Not just exonerated, vindicated. The governor issued a formal apology. The media that once demonized him now painted him as a symbol of resilience. But James didn't care about redemption. He cared about Mia. She had died for the truth. And now the truth had finally set her, and him, free. At her gravesite, James knelt in silence, a fresh bouquet in hand. Elena stood nearby watching. He whispered, "They'll remember you now. Not for how you died, but for who you wouldn't let scare you." 3 months later, James and Elena co-authored a book titled Framed, How Power Kills Truth, with proceeds funding investigative journalism grants in Mia's name. Her legacy lived on, not in silence but in spotlight. And the man who once stood in the shadows? He now sat behind bars. If this story stunned you like it did us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more mind-blowing true crime cases with shocking twists. Leave a comment below. Do you think justice was truly served?